I think quality sometimes comes with this connotation of a delight factor. It just feels right in my hands, or that clicking sound that it makes when I turn the rotation just sounds like quality. That's nice, and it's our job to delight our customers as much as we can, but acceptance criteria can be different. Acceptance criteria are measurable specifications.
Beyond Clean offers a creative look into the inner workings of a healthcare industry committed to getting it right every instrument, every time. Join us every week as we explore the hidden world of one of the most important aspects of safe surgical care. And now your hosts, Michael Matthews, Hank Balch, and Justin Poulin.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Matthew Gudeman, President and CEO of EndoPlus. EndoPlus is a privately held medical device manufacturer with distinct competencies specific to Class II laparoscopic medical devices. Removing cost and complexity from the laparoscopic value stream is core to their mission. EndoPlus is registered with the FDA and holds multiple 510K and patents for laparoscopic devices. Gentlemen, this is going to get a little bit into the weeds. It's an area I'm definitely involved in pretty regularly. It's something that with all of the FDA updates that have been coming out recently, I know we'll talk about that with Matthew as well, but with all of that talk and that chatter and really leaping off the interview with David Ambari, this will be another good episode for people that are fans of manufacturing and third-party repairs.
Yeah, and this is definitely new territory for me. I've moved out of the frontline end user world and into the, third-party repair / vendor world. And so learning about this whole other area that's out there that we're going to be discussing today is really exciting.
It really is one of those things from the user perspective. We hear the FDA is coming out with new documents. We know there's buzz in the industry, like Justin said, in regard to David's episode that we did with the right to repair. But there's still a lot of confusion, a lot of questions. Hopefully, on today's episode, we can get some clarity from Matt to kind of bring it down to a level that's accessible and make it real for sterile processing technicians to walk away from this episode with some real knowledge on what impact these changes will have on their everyday life in sterile processing.
All right, well, before we get started, just a reminder, you can follow Beyond Clean on Twitter at Beyond Clean Info. Go to Facebook.com/Beyond Clean Podcast, LinkedIn.com/company/Beyond Clean. Find us on Instagram, Beyond Clean Podcast. We're posting pictures anonymously, pictures of difficult to clean instruments, key points of inspection. We want you to be all part of that. So if you do have a picture for us, or maybe you've got a recommendation for a future topic or guest on the show, you can send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We'll be right back with Matthew Gudeman, President and CEO of EndoPlus. Joining us now is Matthew Gudeman, President and CEO of EndoPlus. Matt, thanks for coming on the show. I know we had a chance to meet at Isham. Great event for us. I'm sure you had a great time as well, and excited to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being brought on.
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk about design controls and third-party repairs and really the changing FDA conversations in the industry today, really leaping off, I'd say, on an interview that we had with David Ambari several months back, and the FDA obviously taking a position on third-party repair recently. I'm sure a lot of our listeners had a chance to see that come out. I think by the time this airs, it'll be a couple of months since it came out. But I kind of was hoping you'd set the table and tell us a little bit about design controls, what that term means, and how it relates to the work that you're doing at EndoPlus.
Sure, I'd be pleased to. First, my paradigm, unlike that of David's, is that of an OEM manufacturer. So we've been designing and manufacturing laparoscopic instruments here since the early mid-90s. Myself joined in early 2000. But that's the context for how our worldview of that both sides of that right to repair debate. What I wanted to talk a little bit about is to normalize somewhat the design control process. And I would say to think of the design control process as being intentional, to use common sense. it can seem intimidating to hear about it and talk about it, but it's really about common sense, and to understand it is to embrace it.
Along with the decision that just came out, well, by the time this airs, it'll be a couple of months when the FDA made their decision. What is kind of their impact and sort of the impact that the industry such as yours have on the larger conversations about third-party repairs?
Well, in my opinion, there's probably two things that came out of that report. First one, it telegraphed some expectations. It said, one, let's start adopting some quality management principles. It gives some clarity on the difference between servicing and manufacturing, and they define that in that report. And then it sets an expectation to start figuring out how to start gathering evidence or data, which the third parties then can use to assess the quality and safety and effectiveness of medical device servicing. That's one of the two things. The other one is, I believe it hands the third-party repair industry an opportunity to be proactive, to independently take some steps to follow the CDHR, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, their mission, which I think is a great mission, and it is to protect and promote public health. So they've handed them two things. Here's some expectations, and two, hey, here's a head start. We're look like they're basically, I'm paraphrasing terribly, but they're saying, here, we're going to give you a little time. You guys go out without us telling you to, and take some steps to help us meet our mission, which is protect and promote the public health, which in my experience they're doing as a recipient as an OEM who's audited by FDA. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, you did. And Matt, I think I'm looking at this report, and you actually sent us some information to brush up on before the interview, and I know you're just kind of alluding to this a little bit, but I'm going to read the quote from the report. Numerous definitions have been used and proposed for key terms associated with servicing, including refurbishing, reconditioning, rebuilding, remarketing, and remanufacturing. And then they gave us some working definitions as part of a public workshop from October in 2016. And I know really you wanted to focus a lot on design controls relating to those definitions, and I think that's a great place to kind of segue to that third party and take that dive there, because it's a great point. There have been a lot of different definitions, and I kind of liken it to decontamination, right? It's not necessarily meaning disinfection, so it's one of those general terms, and I think what the FDA is trying to do here is to provide some structure and context to the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to take a go at design controls by putting it in the context of a tree swing. I think every one of us probably as a kid had a tree swing. And I started by saying that design controls is really a process about being intentional to use common sense. So design controls, it asks and captures some fundamental questions like, what are the user's needs? In our case, your reusable device must withstand repeated cleaning and sterilization. We make reusable laparoscopic devices. Another question is, what are the intended uses? It's part of our 510K. It's going to fit through a 5mm trocar, grasp, dissect, cauterize tissue, etc. And what are some specified requirements? So an example from my world is a device must meet electrical safety standards, IEC 60601. So it asks some specific questions, forces you to think through things that you would want to know. Some fundamental activities of design control, though, that I believe that are what make it so powerful are the design verification and the design validation. So design verification is where you confirm that the design, that the outputs meet the inputs. If I say it needs to do this, does it? And then design validation is where you put your arms around that whole project at the very end and you say, can we prove that this device does what it's supposed to do? Really simple concepts, which there's details in those processes which can get complex, and they should, and it's okay. But the overall concept of this is really good, and I think it's something that I don't at all resent. In fact, I've embraced it as an OEM that we do this because I've so believed in it. But from my perspective in that conversation on right to repair, I strongly believe that it's something that and some are, I'm sure some are, but in more cases, it's something that can be followed, those principles, especially given which appears the time that they've been given to proactively take some of those steps themselves.
So, Matt, bringing this down to the customer level then, I'm seeing these documents come out from the FDA, and I'm seeing this intramural debate between OEMs and third-party repair, and I'm sitting here as a customer wondering, what does all this have to do with me? I know it sounds like you're supportive of at least the mission and the direction of to have some of these documents, but I'm still unclear exactly the impact this is going to have to frontline technicians in the field.
Well, that's a good question. I mentioned that my paradigm is that of an OEM. It is not that of a third-party basher. I completely see the value there. That's a clarity I want to make. I had mentioned elaborating a bit on design controls in the context of a tree swing. So I'm going to hit a few more points about design controls. You've got design inputs. Example of this, a swing would be reusable. A swing couldn't leave the splinters in the kids' hands. And let's just say that we're planning on a swing to withstand the weight of 12 8-year-olds when they're at a birthday party and all 12 of them decide to get on it. So you got a weight load of 1,400 pounds. So starting this design project, you would start out with a hazard analysis, very high level. You're going to document what can go wrong with the tree swing. For the benefit of time, I'll just go one. Let's say if they put the swing on too weak of a branch, it's going to fall and it can injure or worse, kill a child. Then there's an element of design failure mode effects analysis. That's where you document, you think, you brainstorm as a team. What are all the possible failure modes of each component? So you break it down to a component level. You got your bill of material, your prints. What could go wrong? Here's an example. The UV light from the sun could cause the rope to fail prematurely. Who would have thought of that? Then you go to process failure mode, and you document all the processes, all the failure modes in the process. The manufacturing assembly process could go wrong. So we've got a seat on this thing. We've got a 12-inch by 6-inch by 1-inch thick slab of oak that we're going to make for the seat. What's happening? We said we didn't want any splinters, but do you think that our sanding process could maybe compromise the structural integrity of the seat? So then you move on through this whole process. You're documenting the whole time. You're coming up with inputs, and you're coming up with things that will mitigate those risks. Then you get into design verification. By this point, you've got your prints. You've got some components. You've either bought them or built them. Now you're comparing your prints, the print dimensions to the part dimensions. Then you get into process validation. You're saying, okay, we said that it could be a problem with this sander. Let's actually do it. Let's actually run through it. Let's make sure the controls we got on this process are putting out seats for our swing that are not going to break. We didn't oversand them. They're not too thin. Everything works. And finally, there's design validation. That's where you say, can we prove that this finished device performs as designed? You make a test. You provide data which proves that the swing is reusable. You make a test. You prove that the swing won't leave splinters in their hands or their bottoms. You make a test and you prove that this swing will repeatedly support 1,400 pounds of swinging humanity. Those are the fundamental, just real simple aspects of a design control. Now, how does that apply to a repair? So in our situation, the question I would have, if we go back to these definitions that you mentioned, the FDA specifically said, hey, let's get some clarity on the difference between servicing and remanufacturing. So part of that servicing definition says service includes refurbishing, reconditioning, rebuilding, repairing, or remarketing, but not manufacturing. Remanufacturing, on the other side, FDA gives that a little bit more of a weighty definition, and they're saying that's if you're going to renovate, restore, or any other act done to a finished device that significantly changes the device's performance. Here's my point. As an OEM, we go through all of this work to make sure that we produce something that's not going to fail, and if there are failure modes, that we're mitigating them. There's no reason. It's not that we're that smart. It's not that, at least in my case, it's not that we've got something that the third parties, that's the process that can be used to figure it out. Part of my angst is, on the receiving end, seeing devices that come back in that have clearly been modified by a third party, and it's going to happen, but liberties have been taken which make the device less safe. Does that make sense?
It does. So let me follow up on that then so we can stick with your swing analogy. So I am the consumer. I buy this swing that's been vetted in all those ways that you're talking about. I've got a buddy who is, a great woodworker, and I say, hey, would you cut some holes in this swing so my kid can be a little more aerodynamic? And he's like, oh, sure, I can do that. And then it breaks, and I send it back to the manufacturer and say, hey, got a faulty swing, what's going on here? Is that similar to what you're saying there, where you're seeing modifications that perhaps have not been vetted in all those ways that you're referencing, compromising what would otherwise be an original product with all the original safety, built in?
Yeah, there is. But I think that begs the next step in the progression rather than us just sitting here and arguing with each other. The OEMs saying how stupid the third parties are and all that, and them going back and forth. What is the next step? So as I look at it, for one, I would say it's important not to jump to the conclusion that just because I don't think there's to be necessarily this trade-off. I'm either going to be compliant or we're going to be profitable, compliant or productive. There are ways that we can work together to come up with validated solutions, which will result in both. And so I actually consider the third-party repair industry to be our customers. We work with several of them. Increasingly, I'm coming to them and saying, how can we help you? More so than just providing components, but how can we help you to come up with solutions across the board that will meet the interests of the FDA or of the CDHR to provide devices that are going to be safe. And the tool to do that, in my opinion, is going back to the design controls, because I'm certain there's reasons why OEMs aren't going to provide the exact components or even some of the information, but that does not mean that there's not processes like this that can perhaps even result in devices that are maybe even better.
So, Matt, along kind of those same lines, then I guess the question, it really kind of comes down to a question of quality. And along with that is, when we talk about quality in the manufacturing or the repair of a product, are we talking about, just an individual's preference, or are we talking about an objective standard? And if we're talking about an objective standard, who's measuring it and how are they measuring it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think quality sometimes comes with this connotation of a delight factor. That just feels right in my hands, or that clicking sound that it makes when I turn the rotation just sounds like quality. That's nice, and it's our job to delight our customers as much as we can. But acceptance criteria can be different. Acceptance criteria are measurable specifications. The installation did or did not pass the InsulScan test, or the jaws do or do not open to 50 degrees, and that's what they're supposed to. So those quality versus acceptance criteria, I'm not saying one's not important, but I am saying that acceptance criteria is important, especially if you're going to be making changes to the design. Because there's acceptance criteria that may say, this linkage is going to break after 200 pounds, or this insulation is only designed to withstand this much dielectric current. So those specifications are important. It would be nice if everyone shared. If I'm a third party, it'd be really nice if everyone shared that information. But if they don't, they may have to go find some of it themselves.
Yeah, that's a great point, Matt. And so this is kind of our last question. I know we're moving along really quickly here, but what's the true possibility of getting conformance here? And what are the barriers from that vendor perspective of obtaining conformance?
I clearly have no crystal ball whatsoever, but it would seem to me the CDHR has a pretty good mission to protect and promote public health. And I would also say from experience that compliance with the CDRH's regulations, including but not limited to design controls, produces good results. So it would seem to me that the writing's on the wall. Just from a common sense, the writing's on the wall. OEMs have had it imposed on them, and they've figured out a way to be profitable, to be productive, and to put out some pretty good devices, and just generally speaking. So for that reason, it absolutely can be done. There's really no reason third parties can't utilize the design controls, as we've discussed. I, for one, represent an OEM with capabilities, competencies, and capacity that will partner. If there's a need, this free market is going to respond. So there are companies, I'm sure, who will wish to close off ranks and resist this, but there are probably those of us who will join it because it's the right thing to do. And we finally, our economy, our system is built on trust. It's on doing the right thing. It's on doing what you say we will do. And I think that that report clearly states that there's a need for the third parties. I wouldn't disagree at all, but I think that there's room for the two to cohabitate for sure. And you're talking to one who's willing to do that. One OEM is willing to do that for sure.
Well, and I know, and I'll just piggyback off that as we close, but I know there are some states that make it law that those specifications are made available. And I know it's not national. I know it's not dictated by the FDA, but state law, I think it's 2 states, but I know of at least one that requires the specifications be made available. And a lot of that, I think, came from biomed departments, not really surgical, maybe not the surgical instrument industry, but a lot of the bigger capital equipment pieces and how much biomed ends up servicing that at different hospitals. And they knew that, there's a way to control costs and also maintain patient safety by making that a state law. So maybe if that continues to be common practice around the country, you won't be necessarily as alone in your stance on that as a manufacturer. And working for a third party service organization, I'd say thank you very much for taking that angle.
You're welcome. I really have to commend you on doing your research, talking to someone with a laparoscopic background for you to go and get your appendix out just so you could better understand the customer experience. I just really applaud you for doing that.
Hey, my pleasure. You put a couple extra dollars in the healthcare industry here in the U.S. Yeah.
You got it. Well, our pleasure to be a part of this conversation and perhaps in a small part or maybe a large part in the solution. It is an honor. We, after all, are in the envy of the world, I think. Great healthcare, great economic opportunity. I think it's incumbent upon us to do what we can to figure this out.
Excellent, Matt. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Our pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.
That was Matthew Gudeman, President and CEO of EndoPlus, talking about design controls and why they matter in the surgical instrument industry. And I think it's always helpful, especially with topics like this that can get a little bit into the weeds. And obviously Matthew is a expert, knows his business, but it's great when we can get some sort of an analogy to really illuminate some of the key points in the discussion for the listeners. Hank, Mike, I definitely am interested to keep an eye on this whole FDA and their involvement in third-party repairs and also kind of what I mentioned there at the end, but just state legislature about making the specifications available, to biomed and third-party servicing organizations.
Yeah, Justin, it's such a different world on the other side of the fence from the sterile processing and, surgical professional side of things. We see the product come in our doors and we see it come in new. We see new innovations come out. And then to hear a little bit more about what actually happens on the front end and then how that impacts, as we brought out in this conversation, how it impacts questions about third-party repairs. I really liked the specific highlight that he talked about in terms of objective quality, that it's not just a look or a feel, but it's something that can truly be measured and then measured against. I really found that to be helpful.
I think where it really all boils down to for our listeners who are sitting in their departments trying to figure out what these things mean is that it gives us tools to be able to interact with manufacturers and repair services and really try to distinguish between who is doing very good quality work and who is just out there trying to make a paycheck. Anytime we can have some more ammunition to try and sort through the different qualities that are available out there, it's going to have an impact on our ability to run departments.
Hank, I thought we were going to get through that show without mentioning your personal experience, but Matthew had your number on this episode. It was kind of funny.
Yeah, that's right. And I was actually thinking as we got started with that episode, as he's talking about laparoscopic devices, and I'm sitting here, in my own article that I wrote in reflecting on my appendectomy. I was a patient and I was sitting there with all the thoughts coming out on the sterile processing side of things that I could be concerned about, but it also hit me with the same reality that every other patient feels is, well, I'm here and I need to trust the process and, trust the quality not only in the hospital setting, but it goes back into this specific conversation that we had with Matt is I need to trust the manufacturer. I need to trust the repair vendor, whoever that is for this facility. All kinds of levels of trust that our patients either knowingly, like in my case, or unknowingly trust the system. So many lives depend on us getting it right. So every episode that we do on the podcast is so important, not only for us to grow as an industry, but also to keep patients like us safe.
Yeah, and Bob Mars also shared a similar experiences on his interview. So if anybody on that theme wants to hear the voice of somebody who's been through what Hank's been through, but also has been in the positions as a manager and a sterile processing leader. That Bob Mars episode is an excellent one as well. But that is going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on iTunes and Stitcher. We'd appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to us. And we are getting the podcast now made available on Spotify and Google Play. So as soon as those get indexed, you'll be able to find us there as well. Just search for Beyond Clean Podcast on either of those platforms. If you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, or if you'd like to share a picture anonymously on our Instagram page, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank, Mike, and myself, thank you for listening to another edition of Beyond Clean.